welcome to Afro-Picks. I'm your host, Major, also known as Major in Motion, on all social media platforms. Thank you so much for tuning in to Afro-Picks, brought to you by the Caribbean Cultural Center African Diaspora Institute. Today, well, first of all, let me explain a little bit about what we're doing, right? This is Afro-Picks. It is a new virtual talk series that highlights emerging filmmakers and films set in the communities of the African diaspora. Each program will dive into film scenes and explore specific moments within the filmmaker's exceptional work. These talks enable the filmmaker to go in depth with specific narratives that serve as a strong foundation for their storytelling vision. Today, if you don't already know, you've tuned into as we go into Afro-Latinx Revolution, Puerto Rico. In this original documentary from theGrio, journalist Natasha S. Alford goes on a journey to understand the complexities of Black identity by documenting the experiences of Afro-Latinos living in Puerto Rico during the 2019 summer of political unrest. And if you don't already know and you haven't seen it, please, it's on Amazon Prime and it's on YouTube as well. So before you meet Natasha, let me give you a little background on her, right? So Natasha S. Alford is an award-winning journalist, digital host, and millennial media executive. As Vice President of Digital Content and a senior correspondent at theGrio, she leads a national team in reporting the most critical news and issues impacting the African American community. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, The Guardian, and Oprah magazine. Okay, Oprah, we like that. All right. And she's been a guest contributor on MSNBC, The Breakfast Club, and SiriusXM. In 2020, Natasha was selected for the Poynter Leadership Academy for Women in Media, and in 2018 was named the NABJ Emerging Journalist of the Year and Rolling Out Magazine's Leading Lady in Media. In 2017, she received the Harvard Rising Leader Women's Leadership Award for her work at theGrio. Natasha holds a master's degree in broadcast journalism from the Northwestern University's Medill School of Journalism and a BA from Harvard University. She is the executive producer and the Pulitzer Center-sponsored documentary Afro-Latinx Revolution, Puerto Rico, and is currently producing another documentary for Entertainment Studios about the story of the Black Panthers Angola 3. Let's talk to Natasha.
Hi, Major.
How are you?
I'm wonderful. Good evening, everybody, wherever you are tuning in from. Thank you so much for joining us for this conversation. I'm honored to be here.
I'm honored. I think I've shared with you, I'm a huge fan of your work. So this is like a dream come true to have this conversation with you.
This is wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And I love the background.
We coordinated. We got purple.
I see. I just have a plain background, but hey.
Okay, it all comes together.
Exactly. I'm on a green shirt. I'm giving you Christmas green, even though Christmas is past, but we won't talk about that. So are you're joining us from New York?
I am joining from the great borough of Brooklyn, New York. Shout out to Brooklyn. But yes, when I actually filmed this documentary and worked on a lot of the production, I was still in Harlem. So I've lived in Harlem for about 4 years. And obviously the center is in East Harlem. So, have dropped by there as well. But it's great to be home and to have some time to reflect on what was really an intense summer when all of this went down. And I'm so glad that people are, they're reacting positively to the documentary and to a lot of the issues that we bring up. So it makes me really happy.
No, I loved the documentary. I thought that it was well done. And I loved also, before we get into the clips, about the vintage TV and the vintage moments in the documentary. I was like, this is okay.
That's all Mikey Cordero, who was the photographer, the videographer, and the editor, and really just a creative partner in the project. So shout out to Mikey for hooking that up. But yeah, it was pretty cool.
Yeah, I liked it. And for those of you who don't know how this is going to go, is we're going to see a clip and then we're going to come back and I'm going to engage with Natasha in conversation around the clip. All right. So without further ado, let's go to the first clip.
Yo me llamo puertorriqueño. Hay una diversidad. Personas dicen que son afro-puertorriqueños, otros dicen que son afro-latinos. Yo no digo eso. Yo digo que yo soy puertorriqueño porque nosotros tenemos la raza africana, española, tenemos raza francesa. Nosotros somos una mezcla. Todas esas razas encierran lo que es un puertorriqueño.
Y el trasfondo de esta actividad, que es el Día Internacional de las Mujeres Afrodescendientes, nace un 25 de julio en el 1992, donde mujeres negras...
Yo creo que siempre ha estado desde que nací esa conciencia de que soy una mujer negra. Bien interesante esa dinámica en los Estados Unidos porque los afrolatinos, yo conversaba el otro día con mi primo sobre esto. We are too Latin to be black, or we are too black to be Latinos. So for us it's very hard.
Yo me defino como una mujer negra, como una mujer afrodescendiente. Importante ser una mujer no blanca. Soy una mujer que se identifica como con esa ancestralidad y con esa herencia y legado africano que también tiene una mezcla y unos saberes y un ADN que viene también de otras poblaciones. Así que hay un mestizaje en Puerto Rico y hay gente que se identifica unos más negros que otros, pero esta que está aquí se identifica como afroborico.
Folklore dancers perform the bomba. The rhythmic drum music rings in your ears long after you've left the island.
Bomba originated on sugar plantations more than 400 years ago. Africans who were stolen during the transatlantic slave trade created bomba, a music and dance genre, to uphold and create new culture during gatherings, but also to plan slave uprisings and escapes. They overcame language barriers with music and using their bodies. Characterized by call and response singing and interaction between dancers and drummers, bomba, along with the music and dance genre plena, represents a mix of many different cultural elements of Puerto Rico, but it is unquestionably black.
I love the music from Loíza, the bomba, the plena. It's like something that you get like spiritual. It make you feel good, it make you feel sad, it make you feel bad. You got all the feelings in there, so depends on how you're feeling, you're gonna make the music. You're gonna find it in Loíza music, in the bomba.
Eso siempre, desde muy pequeño, desde que siempre me criaba en Loíza y siempre que veía los Ayala y todo eso me venía a la mente que quería escuchar la bomba a otro nivel. Y pues eso es lo que estoy tratando de hacer, fusionándola con la música urbana de hoy en día.
Debe estar en otro nivel, ¿sabes? No le dan el valor que realmente necesita y que debe tener.
Does this just make you want to dance?
I know. The whole time while I was looking at the clip, I'm like, bum, 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 bum. It was so great. It was so great. That's one of the reasons why I picked this clip, because outside of that and the historical component, right? Like, you offered a little bit of history, and we'll get into more history as we view more clips. But I wanted to ask you, like, you shared a little bit about your family. For those of you who didn't see earlier in the documentary, Natasha shares a little bit about her own family and their history. And I was just wondering, was it difficult to set aside your own perception of Blackness from, being from Syracuse, right? You're from Syracuse, right? Yes. Was it difficult to set aside your own perception of Blackness growing up here in the US, or stateside rather, in comparison to when you went to Puerto Rico and heard different ideologies around Blackness?
So it's a great question. And the truth is that as a journalist, we often have to set aside, actually, every time you sit down to interview someone, you have to set aside your perceptions of what you think should be necessarily true, or how other people should think, to be open and to listen. That is the key to journalism. And so I went to Puerto Rico fully open and willing to hear all views and perspectives about Blackness. And I think often when we think about Afro-Latinos, we hear two stereotypes, right? Or we see two stereotypes or extremes. One is the Afro-Latino who hates Blackness. He's like, I'm not Black, I'm insert whatever nationality. And then on the other end is this, very Afrocentric, the down to, head wraps. Again, maybe they play Bomba. It's sort of a perception that makes Blackness to be only limited to the very traditional interpretation of whatever traditions are, in a community or on an island, almost to other it, almost to make it as if the Blackness is not part of every part of the culture, right? Whether we're talking about, being Boricua or just Latinidad in general, and the influence of Africa in our entire, way of being. So I knew that maybe that is true, but in between, there's also some truth, right? And so you'll see people in this documentary who represent so many different perspectives. And I think Jose is one of the more controversial, not even controversial, but just might confound you a little bit, because he plays Bomba. He's literally playing these rhythms that have been passed down directly from Africa, but he's telling you he does not call himself Afro-Latino. And so that is the nuance. That is where you can find, a lot of the truth, is when you go into the complexity. So I say all that to say, came to the island very open and expecting to hear a variety of perspectives, and wanted to make sure that they were represented, while also making sure that we corrected the record. Right. And the reality is that a lot of Puerto Ricans, when you're growing up, I know what I heard. My mother is Puerto Rican. My father is African American. My mother would tell me that we are a mix of everything. So we're Spanish, Taino, indigenous, and we are African. And the truth is, not every Puerto Rican actually is that mix. Right. There is a range. There are Puerto Ricans who are very much, European in phenotype and DNA, and very African, right? Or very indigenous. So you're going to see all of that. But within that story of, we're just all a mix, we're all the same, a lot of nuance is lost. And sometimes it can be manipulated, unfortunately, for not the best political purposes. So we'll get into it. But yeah, it was certainly an incredible reporting experience to just step outside of myself and to listen to other people and see what they had to say.
Yeah. And for those of you who have not seen the documentary yet, which I don't know why, I mean, hello. But
I'll give you the weekend to catch up.
Yes. And it's on Prime. Come on, guys. What are you waiting for? But I thought it was really interesting. There's a part where you talk about the beauty standards, right? And you show beauty queens that have represented Puerto Rico and also other Spanish-speaking countries as well. And I was like, oh, wow, yes, that's a huge contradiction to what we're seeing and you highlighting through this documentary. So yeah, shout out to you. I was like, oh, this.
Thank you. Right. No, our beauty standards say a lot about how we really feel, right? So yes, you can tell everybody they're all equal and they're all beautiful, but if all your beauty queens are white, or they're never Black, then what does that say about how much you value Blackness and whether you think Black is beautiful? And if people aren't allowed to wear their hair naturally without somebody saying pelo malo, what does that say about how we accept people? Do people have to change and transform and be more Eurocentric to be accepted or to be seen as worthy? And so all of those things are questions I think we should ask.
Absolutely. And now that I'm hearing you speak on that, I'm like, now it makes me wonder, are there Black dolls in Puerto Rico? Are there all of these resources that I think, if you're in the stateside rather, you take for granted, we have resources to get these things. But I'm like, even in beauty standards, do little girls see themselves even in the toy store?
Right.
That's
commercials,
Absolutely.
Right. And when we say things like, we're happy that people are wearing rizos now and they have curls, are you still only seeing super light skin, white or mestiza representation in that representation of natural hair? All really important to interrogate.
Texturism.
Real everywhere you go.
Exactly. So we're going to get into the next clip. Enjoy.
While Loíza has one of the highest populations of Black residents, Blackness in Puerto Rico is not just confined to one area. You'll find Puerto Ricans of African descent anywhere, from Carolina to Santurce, Arroyo, Ponce, Humacao, and beyond. When it comes to describing African heritage or Black racial identity in Puerto Rico, there are just as many terms as there are skin tones. An increasingly popular and highly debated term is Afro-Latino, Afro-Latina, or Afro-Latinx. The X is a gender-neutral form of the word. In 2001, the term Afro-Latino was officially adopted at the UN World Conference on Racism in Durban, South Africa. It was useful to create a unifying term that could bring Afro-descendants together to organize for their political and social interests while recognizing the shared oppression faced by Black communities throughout Latin America.
Yo creo que el término afrodescendiente es un término reciente, acuñado recientemente desde el 2001 por grupos afrodescendientes, por poblaciones negras en Latinoamérica. Así que es un término que está conociéndose ahora en Puerto Rico. Y yo creo que el término hay que conocerlo un poco mejor para poder aglutinar más personas, porque es un término político y es un término que se trata de descolonizar de la palabra negro.
Often in the United States, when we say the word Black, we automatically think African American. But the truth is that Blackness is not a monolith, and there is the African Diaspora, which is rich and diverse in terms of history and experiences. Pues yo creo que siempre me llamaron negra en casa, ¿verdad? Negrita siempre estaba ahí. Hay más afrodescendientes en América, en todas las Américas, que personas claras de piel. Así que lamentablemente es un efecto de racismo y cómo se ha invisibilizado toda una comunidad afro-latina.
Yo soy negro, tengo el pelo bien rizo.
¿Tú eres dominicano? Y yo no. ¿Tú eres cubano? Y yo no. Puertorriqueño, y me decían, guste, porque ellos piensan que una persona puertorriqueña es clara de color, con pelo colorado, bajita, una mujer, y el varón es blanquito, con ojos claros.
But on the 2000 U.S. Census, more than 80% of Puerto Ricans on the island identified as white. with 8% labeling themselves as Black, 4% as multiracial, and nearly 7% as other. In 2010, the number of Boricuas who identified as white dropped to 76%, and more than 12% identified as Black. For some, terms like Afro-Latinx are U.S. continental imports that they can't relate to, just like strict race definitions of Black and white.
Yo soy puertorriqueño. Yo soy del continente latinoamericano. Y somos descendientes de África, la mayoría de nosotros. Pero yo no puedo decir que yo soy africano. Yo soy puertorriqueño.
¿Verdad? Así que es un entendimiento que poco a poco creo que en Puerto Rico la gente podría ir entendiendo y acuñarlo si quiere. Yo creo que si conocen los propósitos, las definiciones, la categoría del término, cómo se acuña, cómo se va desarrollando, hay probabilidades de que haya más personas que quieran acuñar ese término y autodefinirse como afrodescendientes.
Mucha gente aquí en Puerto Rico niega que existe racismo y precisamente dicen que nosotros somos una mezcla de las tres razas y no queremos afrontar los issues que traen el racismo. Y para mí como mujer negra crecer, por ejemplo, y estar presente en muchos espacios, mi visita a la farmacia está velada por el guardia de seguridad, siempre.
All right. Much to discuss here. One thing, I know, let's take a deep breath. So I picked this clip in particular because you break down a lot. You break down what Latino, Latina, you break down the whole gambit, right? Mm-hmm. And you also mentioned that it is a stateside conception of identity. And how perhaps in Puerto Rico, a lot of people don't identify with Latinx, etc. Right? I also loved how you provided the census and how it changes.
A little bit.
Yeah, a little bit. I mean, maybe there's a steady climb. We'll see. But what I did find very, very, very interesting was that I believe his name is Jose. Yes, Jose and Sasha, the media professional and publisher, Sasha. It was very interesting how they had total polar different ideology, like how they envisioned themselves, right? Mm-hmm. And so I was wondering, my question to you is, do you think gender has anything to do with it? Or is it just phenotypically how you look? Or because that was just so interesting to me.
Yeah, it's another really good question. I think we didn't dig into addressing it head on, right? I think the reality is that we live in intersectionality. So, gender, identity, race, all of those things come together. There's no way that you can separate them. And I know I have some friends who have theories about how gender influences the way that, people see themselves, particularly Afro-Latino men, maybe even their dating preferences, things like that. So although we didn't dig into that, I do think some things that came up in my reporting that did make an impact, family, right? So if you come from a family that is also Black and is proud. So in Sasha's case, her family, said Black from day one, and they had no problem with that. Mm-hmm. And so there was an acceptance, a love, a normalization. Sometimes you may find that if someone's coming from a mixed racial background, again, all Puerto Rican, but maybe the mom is white Puerto Rican, or a really mixed and very light, and the father is a Black Puerto Rican or very dark skinned, that person may get mixed messages. One of the persons that I interviewed, a business owner in San Juan, he said that on his birth certificate, it says white for both parents, even though his father is darker than me, darker than him. And so, yeah. And so family perception. And also he was told, you're not Black like them, because they lived in New York City for a little bit. Even though they're Puerto Rican, they moved to New York City. And it was very clear that like Black people were something distinct from quote unquote Hispanics. And so it was better to identify as Hispanic. So I think there's some family sort of teaching that shapes people's self-perception, but that's also just part of a larger trend of blanqueamiento, this whitening that happens not just in Puerto Rico, but in Latin America at large, because to whiten your country or your population makes you more attractive in these sort of global and foreign relations, right? A lot of the elite, the rich, the powerful, they tend to be white Latinos. And so they want the population to be seen as white because they think that there are advantages to that. And the truth is, because of white supremacy, there are some advantages when you present that way. So what we saw with the census was that there was actually, I spoke with a professor, Mara Loveman, who talked about this effort to whiten the population. And there were people who somebody would come and write, be a census taker. This was before you filled out your own, and would change people's like racial identification, like, this person's white, you saw a shift. You saw a shift between certain censuses where all of a sudden it was like the white population was more than what it was before. And it was about presenting a certain way, which I think is like pretty mind blowing. And then, the shift that we saw, we go from 80%, and it's like 80% of Puerto Rico is white racially, down to 76%. There were activists who said that they actively went out after that first census and educated. They held special programming. They wrote op-eds. They pissed a lot of people off. Sure. But they started to address race, and they're like, guys, this is not realistic. Our self-perception, something about this is off because we are not, the majority of us are not white. It's something else that was interesting. Dr. Martha Moreno Vega, who gets so much credit, right? She's why we're here. And she's a pioneer and a scholar, and just somebody who has done tremendous work leading on this subject, said that we have to be careful about putting people in boxes that they don't use, right? Using language that they don't use. So the whole concept of, are you white? Are you Black? Are you, it's not necessarily reflective of the language that is used on the island. On the island, you will hear lots of different terms, trigueño, moreno, indio, but let's not pretend like Blackness and whiteness is something that just came from the continental US, right? Because a lot of people think, oh, that's just those, the people in the US, here on this land, are obsessed with race. It's just that they always want to make everything black and white. But that's not something that came with US imperialism. That was there from the colonial days, from the days that the Spanish decided to steal Africans and enslave them and bring them to the island, because slavery was tied to race. Even though a lot of racial mixing did happen, Africans were treated as inferior. They were treated as on the bottom of the caste system. And the Spanish Empire actually allowed people to buy their way out of certain racial categorizations. So if you had enough money and you could prove that you had a white ancestor within a certain number of generations, you could buy a different categorization and be bumped up to white. And so these are just all like, it's fascinating history. But I say all that to say, yes, race is spoken about differently on the island, but at the end of the day, that caste system is still there, where white is on top and Black is on the bottom. And if you fall somewhere in between, cool, but you always know that the closer you are to whiteness, the closer you are to privilege and opportunity.
Yes, all of that. Which is also a great segue into what we're about to see, which covers on racism in Puerto Rico. Me personally, I found it very fascinating because I'm like, I don't think this is a topic of discussion that is often linked to the Spanish-speaking Americas, right? Mm-hmm. In terms of like racism. So let's look at the next clip.
Soy culpable de mi pelo rizo y de mis labios gruesos. Si ser negro es un crimen, llévenme preso. Mientras no haya justicia, la ley nunca tendrá peso. Habrá violencia.
Eso es parte de lo que ha reproducido el racismo aquí en Puerto Rico.
Antes era bien notable, era bien marcado, era castigado, era maltratado. Pues ahora el maltrato es físico, no físico, psicológico.
Attorney Marcos Rivera has represented clients who face police brutality or discrimination, including Alma Yariela Cruz, then an 11-year-old girl who was racially harassed at school. After she fought back in defense, police arrested the child.
Y estoy muy orgulloso de ser negro y defiendo mi raza. Y cuando me hice abogado dije, yo voy a defender los míos. Y aquí, desafortunadamente, el pobre y el negro están marcados y se abusa de ellos.
Maraliz Rivera is Marco's daughter and fellow attorney.
Siempre me tengo que identificar primero como puertorriqueña y claro, por mi color negra. Yo soy una mujer negra y vengo con mi pelo natural y mi pelo afro y no solamente vengo como quizás pudieran pensar que soy una acusada o que soy una parte perjudicada en el caso, no, es que yo vengo como una abogada del caso.
Hasta que no todo el mundo tenga la conciencia del valor de la cultura del negro, de que el negro no es inferior al blanco, de que el negro ha aportado mucho al desarrollo del mundo desde las civilizaciones antiguas, hasta que no aprenda a tener esa conciencia, a saber lo que somos y lo que valemos, no nos podemos defender.
El racismo es estructural. El racismo en Puerto Rico es un racismo que parte desde las estructuras hegemónicas del país, de quienes gobiernan, ¿verdad? De quienes hacen las estructuras, que no solamente en Puerto Rico, con esa relación colonial que tiene con los Estados Unidos, las políticas surgen de aquí, sino que vienen de los Estados Unidos, ¿verdad? En relación a Puerto Rico.
Puerto Rico was an island originally inhabited by the indigenous Taíno people and called Borinquen, which stands for Land of the Brave Lord. Taínos were known for their advanced agricultural skills, organized villages, and matrilineal society where women also had leadership roles. In 1493, Christopher Columbus failed his second attempt to reach Hispaniola and instead accidentally landed in Puerto Rico. Followed by Spanish colonizer Juan Ponce de León, the arrival commenced an era of disease, forced labor, and violence, which led to resistance, including a Taíno uprising in 1511. But still, the colonizers almost decimated the Taíno population. As soon as the early 1500s, Spain would begin enslaving West Africans to replace Taíno labor. They stole them from places like the Gold Coast in Nigeria to mine gold, build forts, and tend to crops like sugarcane and tobacco. However, some of the first Africans on the island were free blacks who arrived with Spain and were known as libertos. Blacks who escaped slavery were known as cimarrones and would be credited with building towns like Loíza, where many of their descendants live today. Slavery in Puerto Rico officially lasted until March 22, 1873. Like many enslaved African Americans, Black Puerto Ricans were forced into working for 3 years after slavery ended, while their owners were compensated for each human life that was to be set free. About 25 years after slavery ended, the U.S. would take control of the island in 1898. Anti-Black sentiment was only further reinforced. Even Afro-Boricua military members served in segregated units. Soon, the idea of La Gran Familia Puertorriqueña, the great Puerto Rican family, would be birthed. It's a metaphor for one nation, racially and socially integrated in harmony, but some call it a lie.
Whew, okay.
that part was heavier, right?
Yes. But once again, you're offering history, which I think is super, super important when it comes to topics of identity, right? And you really, really get to the meat and potatoes of the history. So shout out to you for that. But I wanted to know, while you were there or anytime you've ever been in Puerto Rico, have you experienced racism?
So for this project, I wasn't in Puerto Rico for too long. Actually, that was one of the stressors of a project like this, because, you know, I was given a grant. It lasted for, I want to say, maybe 5 days. And so anywhere I went on the island, chances were, you know, if I was reporting, I was with a local resident or one of my team members. So I don't really think that I was there long enough to, well, you know, anything could happen. But I think that when people spend a lot of time in a place, they can pick up on some of those subtleties, right? And in the subtleties, that is where you can see racism play out. So actually kind of going back to the clip that we just watched, I think each interviewee touches on the ways that racism shows up. So there is, you know, the overt racism. I'm enslaving you, right? I'm, you know, enslaving you because of your skin color. I'm calling you names. There is the subtle racism of, you know, when Maralise was saying she shows up with her natural hair. And sometimes people are a little bit surprised. Oh, you're the attorney? You're the person who's actually leading the case, as if like she couldn't do it because she's a Black woman. And then there is the systemic racism, which is what Maricruz was talking about, where certain parts of the island are neglected because they tend to be Blacker and poorer. You know, she talked about in the wake of Hurricane Maria, the richer, whiter part of the island had their electricity restored within like a couple of days, whereas her part,
shocking,
right? It sounds just like what, you know, what is out here on the in the continental U.S., right, where certain parts of even New York City, right, like will get attention or not get attention, and you know where Black folks live, where white folks live. So I think it's really important to think about racism in that way. And so no, you know, maybe no one like called me a name when I was there, but there are many ways in which racism does show up, and I have a lot more examples of, you know, things that people told me and what I learned there that I can share.
Okay. Okay. I wonder also, is there sort of this, when you're coming from the States, even though for those of you who don't know that Puerto Rico is a U.S. colony, so it is a part of it's a part of the U.S. But although you mentioned you may have not been there long enough to perhaps experience racism, did you feel a sense of privilege perhaps because you're coming from the continental U.S.?
Yeah, so I think that I think depending on who's looking at me, you know, I can read as a Black American, as in a other, you know, someone who just assumes that I'm African American and I'm visiting as a tourist, right? And they may treat me a certain way. Doesn't mean that you won't experience racism, because there's definitely Black Americans who've experienced racism in Puerto Rico, but there is a kind of privilege that comes with that. And then I think there are people who may have just assumed I was, you know, just Puerto Rican and from there, depending on, again, there's so many different cues, right? And so even though, you know, I'm Puerto Rican by blood, I'm still there. Yeah, like I'm still from, you know, a different place. And I'm very conscious of the fact that I'm still an outsider. I'm still a guest in this community. I'm coming in from the outside telling this story. So that may have influenced the way that people treated me. I don't speak Spanish fluently, so I spoke the Spanish that I'm comfortable speaking to get by and to get to different places. And,
did you feel pressure at all?
I think I felt, well, it kind of depended on who I was with. Marcos is actually great because he kept saying, your Spanish is good. Like, my pronunciation, he's like, it's good. Why are you being shy? And I think a lot of Latinos who live in the continental US have had that struggle of like pressure to speak English. I know my mom grew up in the Bronx, and when she spoke Spanish, it was discouraged. She came up at a time where they were like, you need to learn English so you can get ahead in life, or that Spanish is somehow, a signifier of a bad thing. And there was a whole generation that was taught to like put their Spanish to the side and prioritize English. And so she told me that there was a teacher or like someone who told her, oh, don't speak both languages to her, she'll be confused, which we know is a lie. I mean, people can be bilingual, but that fear, that sense of, I don't want my kid to be discriminated against, caused my mom to emphasize English once I hit about 5 years old. So I'm one of those Latinas who hears everything and understands everything, but I'm most comfortable speaking in English. I don't really like making mistakes. I got to get over that. Mm-hmm. But Marcos made me comfortable, seeing this confident, he's just a regal Black man. Like, he's just
his positioning. I was like, okay.
For anyone who's tuning in, he was the lawyer. Obviously he's an OG. He got the gray hair. He's been around and he knows his stuff. And he's argued and defended Black Puerto Rican clients against, in these cases of discrimination. So he's seen a lot in his life, but the pride in being from Loíza and being a Black Puerto Rican and his success, the fact that he was able to make it, even though he was like the only Black person in his, law school class back in the day. Can you imagine?
Yeah.
And that's what we mean by structural racism, which keeps, it's like Black Puerto Ricans are around, but as they try to ascend in society, they may find those educational barriers or job opportunities lacking where, they don't get to move up even though they have a certain skill set. And so for him to succeed and for me to be in his law office in Carolina, I was just blown away. It really moved me to tears just to see him, just to see his presence. So long tangent, but basically he made me feel the most comfortable practicing my Spanish or asking questions in Spanish when I was there. But yes, I think it just, there may have been things that I didn't even pick up on when I was there. But fortunately, it was a good experience. I came away without like any drama, but I was able to get other people to open up about what they went through. And that's not easy to get people to talk about race, which is super taboo, especially on a deadline.
Well, we'll revisit this. So we're going to jump into the next clip and we'll come right back.
Okay.
A lot of the structural and systemic issues that we are constantly referring to play themselves out in the way we think about things like race and class and everything else. So those people who were in a position to really talk about any of these issues and have a voice, a public voice, tended to be of the upper class, and those tended to be white. So most of what the discussion in Puerto Rico tends to be somewhat elitist, comes from a very white optic, is very conciliatory in the sense that the traditional way of talking about race in Latin America has been to not rock the boat too much, to use your friendships with those in power to advance your agenda, even if it's an agenda that's not necessarily to their benefit.
The people of Puerto Rico haven't had a good relationship with their government. And what's made things even worse is the same thing that makes many other relationships get worse: text messages.
Tonight, a huge protest is underway in Puerto Rico, where the governor is refusing to step down over a scandal involving leaked private messages.
Governor Ricardo Rosselló has been under fire since nearly 900 pages of a private group chat were leaked and published.
The chat is filled with profane, homophobic, and sexist messages.
The messages reveal the men mocking women, disabled people, and Hurricane Maria victims. There are even jokes about bodies piled up in a government facility. Rosselló has apologized for the messages, but refuses to leave office.
I need to move forward and continue on the work that we're doing for Puerto Rico.
Tonight, more protesters are on the streets of San Juan demanding Puerto Rico's governor resign.
Que un gobernador renuncie por unas protestas del pueblo, eso es un acto glorioso. Eso es un acto, uno de los actos históricos más importantes que ha tenido el país en siglos.
Yo creo que hay unos reclamos, yo creo que fue bien poderoso, ¿verdad? Si vemos cómo, por ejemplo, en muchas de las manifestaciones, para hacer ruido se usa la plena. Para resistir con el cuerpo y con nuestra voz usamos la bomba. Para usar el cuerpo hicimos un perreo combativo frente a la catedral y fueron las comunidades negras y las comunidades queer las que lo hicieron. Cuando miramos todas esas manifestaciones, esas son manifestaciones negras. Ricky renunció el 24 de julio y el 25 de julio se celebra en América Latina el Día Internacional de la Mujer afrodescendiente, negra, caribeña.
Nace un 25 de julio en el 1992, donde mujeres negras de 32 países de América Latina y el Caribe se reunieron.
Así que hicimos una manifestación tipo performance celebrando el Día Internacional de la Mujer afrodescendiente y la mujer negra, y fue un éxito. Un buen día para recordarnos que nosotros desde abajo, como personas empobrecidas, como comunidades negras, tuvimos el poder y logramos sacar de allá arriba a la gente que está en el poder y a la gente rica que yo creo que se reproduce, ya no se manifiesta la cosa en la hacienda con negros esclavos. Aquí vimos un pueblo que se levantó contra una clase que nos oprime constantemente, que son la clase de los ricos, que está en la política, que maneja, ¿verdad?, todos los intereses, que juega con nuestras tierras, con nuestras viviendas, con nuestra salud, con nuestra educación. Así que yo creo que hicimos la mejor muestra de rebelión, de cimarronaje que habíamos hecho en la historia, y lo logramos.
I just love the music. Every time I'm like loving the music. Oh, it's so great.
Between the music and Sasha's voice, I could just listen to Sasha talk all day. I mean,
listen. So, Sasha, if you're watching, I love you. I love everyone in the documentary. Let's be clear. But I just to your point, the way she approaches language to me is just so. It's amazing, and I can just hear the passion for what she does. And for those of you who haven't seen the documentary in its full, you'll see that. But I wanted to know, right? So we're seeing a lot of similarities between Black Puerto Ricans and also other Afro-descendant communities globally, right? Mm-hmm. But my question is, were you surprised by we just saw the contemporary history that you highlighted in this part of the documentary, but were you surprised by any, or perhaps didn't know of something both historically or something that's happening now? Were you just kind of like, oh, wow, I didn't know that?
Well, there was a lot of untold history, or history that you don't, see promoted as much as it should be promoted. I think one of the things that stood out was this idea that enslaved Africans in Puerto Rico still worked for years after slavery was abolished. And that's one of the things I think we all have to challenge ourselves to dig into history to understand, because we read these history books and we're just like, oh, in this year, the slaves were emancipated. And then it's like, yay. And then everything was all fixed, right? And it's like, no, that's not true. Right. Why was it that the system allowed these residents, these Black people, to be forced to have to work for years after? And it shows how, even if you don't have the title of enslavement, conditions of enslavement still exist, okay? And in the continental US, we saw that with sharecropping and, African Americans who had to sign these awful labor contracts where they were essentially slaves, even without the title. So seeing that similarity in Puerto Rico was really striking to me. And knowing that, they celebrated their freedom in the same way that we have the Juneteenth celebration here, just shows that we have a lot in common. Yes, we are different, and we should acknowledge those differences in history because there is nuance, right? But the Black diaspora and within this Latin American context, it's really important for us to unpack those connections and see us as part of a struggle together. And so that's where the doc starts to go, is when Black Lives Matter protests really started to pick up again in 2020. You see this alliance and you see this, this support, this allyship coming from Puerto Ricans, and particularly within, predominantly Black Puerto Rican communities, because yes, they too are over policed. They too walk into the pharmacy, as Sasha said, and people follow them around. I went to the ACLU of Puerto Rico to do interviews, and there was a young woman there who she was just there in a store, in a mall with her sister, and the security guard kicked her out of the store as she was standing waiting, for her sister to drop off her resume. I can't remember if it was the sister or her, but this idea that she was suspicious, there was just no other reason for it other than the color of her skin. And this is a young woman who, even though she's dark skinned, she, maybe necessarily didn't call herself Black. She didn't come from Loíza, which is a predominantly Black Puerto Rican area, but she's dealing with this systemic racism, right? Something else we saw, the Blackface characters who, by the way, were on TV and people were laughing, and it wasn't like that was 50 years ago. I mean, this is like pretty recent in terms of media outlets that were running these images and people who think it's funny. And if you go on YouTube now, you'll see comments within, not maybe like a couple of years, where people are laughing and they think it's great. And it's just part of the culture. It's no big deal. Pirulo, Chianita, these particular characters. Why is it that people laugh at people in blackface? What is so funny about being Black that people find it to be a joke, right? To be comedy. The insults of Black people being inferior. All these ideologies still persist long after slavery. And this is what these activists are fighting. This is what people are fighting against, and trying to teach a new generation to be proud of being Black, that nothing is wrong with being Black. That little girl who Marcos, the lawyer, went and defended, you'll see in the documentary, she was teased and called racial slurs for a very long time, and the school did nothing. But when she decided to fight back and got in a physical altercation, they arrested this child. She was 12 years old and they arrested her, right? And so criminalizing Black children, hello, we see that in the United States, the continental US as well, the school to prison pipeline. So if I haven't given you enough examples of the ways in which, we are all tied in the struggle together, even with these geographical borders that we have, I hope this documentary opens that conversation up.
Thank you, because that's one of the things that I really, really, really enjoyed, the historical element to this whole documentary. And it just makes me think, like, are these kids even getting it in school there. Like, you know, you're telling a story. However, I'm like, wow, like, is this accessible in the school system?
I had to be a grown-up who asked for a grant to go on a reporting trip to learn a lot of stuff.
Right.
Imagine if I'm looking for this information at this point in my life, in my adult life, there are kids who want this information too. And that is also racism when you erase people from a story, when you erase them from history. They don't see images of themselves as leaders. It's just, you were slaves and like, that's it, you know, and that form of erasure is violence. And so, yes, I do think there are a lot of kids who are not getting this education. And so that's why everybody who's in this space, everyone doing work around these issues is doing some really important work.
And shout out to them. Mm-hmm. But on a lighter note, you guys are about to meet some famous Black Puerto Ricans that you probably didn't even know was Puerto Rican. So let's roll this clip.
Esto tiene que cambiar. Me parece que Puerto Rico está viviendo una revolución. Un pueblo indignado se tiró a la calle y sacaron a un gobernador de su fortaleza. Igualmente, esto puede ser la punta de lanza para que Puerto Rico despierte, para que terminemos de una vez con el problema del discrimen racial en este país.
Mami, ¿quieres ir a casa a buscar limones?
Voten por yo, voten por yo. Subo la parda y bajo los pantalones. Ay, negra, y bajo los pantalones.
Chianita nunca fue negra, como nunca lo fue Diplo, ni fue Willy, ni Pirulo, ni otros bufos mercaderes. No representó a mujeres dignas de mi raza prieta.
So activism is not just about protesting. A lot of the times it's about changing the way people think and see themselves, and that can be done through the media.
Yeah. Como Coco. This is the project that we did with youth here in Loíza. It was a cultural project and also like economic development for them, for the projects.
Oh, great.
With Fundación Buena Vibra. Los medios de comunicación son clave, han sido claves para ese proceso, las redes sociales. Eso, y todavía no hay una representación, ¿verdad?, que sea equitativa con la cantidad de negras y negros que hay en Puerto Rico. Eso todavía es algo que tenemos que retar y que continuar haciendo que pase, que tengamos más negras y más negros en los medios de comunicación. Así que nuestra forma de resistencia es hablando de esas cosas que nadie quiere hablar y presentándolo todo desde lo grande que somos y lo bello y poderosos que somos.
The fight also extends to being counted on the U.S. Census. After the 2000 census results painted the island as mostly white, the anti-racist group Colectivo ILE began organizing. Their campaign aims to educate Puerto Ricans about proud African roots, Afro-Puerto Rican pioneers like Ruth Fernandez, Roberto Clemente, and historian Arturo Alfonso Schomburg. And like this 2010 census PSA from the Afro-Latino Forum, they're directly challenging anti-blackness.
Sabes que no me gusta que juegues con morenos.
Pero abuela, si esos morenos son latinos.
They want Puerto Ricans with visible Black heritage to check Black or write in Afrodescendiente. By claiming and counting Black populations, they hope to usher in change for a new era.
Si la gente, si el pueblo no está consciente de que están siendo discriminados por cuestiones de raza, por cuestiones de clase social, pues entonces no pueden reclamarlo. Por eso es un asunto que hay que asumirlo políticamente, como la palabra afrodescendiente es un asunto político, ¿verdad? Lo está mirando desde un grupo. Estamos denunciando que un colectivo, que un grupo de gente está siendo menospreciada, discriminada, tiene menos recursos que otros. Hay gente negra que llega menos a la universidad, teniendo tal vez más capacidad que otra gente, pero no son la mayoría que llega a la universidad. Así que todos estos asuntos tenemos que verlo en relación a cómo hay unos que tienen más recursos, más oportunidades de llegar y otros ni tan siquiera se les considera.
Once again, the music, even the background music.
The images are really stunning. And again, shout out to Mikey Cordero from Defend PR who shot those images. You know, it's really him being on the ground that elevated this entire documentary. So thank you, Mikey and Francis.
Thank you so much. And you get to just see how vibrant the spirit of the people are. Mm-hmm. Even I found myself looking beyond the people sometimes that are featured, because I'm looking at the trees and all of the things that are surrounding these individuals. And it's just beautiful to see. So switching topics a little bit, we met a lot of famous Black Puerto Ricans, right? Mm-hmm. We met Ruth Fernandez, Arturo Schomburg, etc. Why was it so important for you to feature these historical figures in this particular documentary?
For sure. So the individuals that you saw, these Black Puerto Rican leaders and pioneers, are actually part of a curriculum that Colectivo ILE teaches, and it is part of their census campaign. So after the census of 2000, in which 80% of census takers said that they were white, Colectivo ILE, which is an anti-racism group, a feminist collective, got together and they said, you know, how do we educate? Because education is a huge part of it, right? If you don't see yourself as Black, it may mean that no one ever taught you reasons to understand why that mattered. So they went about this education campaign, and they're asking people to check Black on the census, which is important, and I'll get to that in a second. But they recognize that it's not just telling people check a box, it's instilling pride in them. And that's what we mean about erasure. If you don't have figures to look up to, why would you think that it matters to claim your Blackness? Or how do you know the ways in which these people have shaped the entire culture and society that you live in? And for me, you know, I take a lot of interest in Mr. Schomburg, because if you live in Harlem, you walk by the Schomburg Center all the time. And a lot of folks don't know he's Puerto Rican. You know, he's very prominent in the African American community, and he centered a lot of his studies and his work. Actually, I have this book right here about him, like Blackness. And he chose to focus on creating libraries of Black studies and accomplishments. So I like to think that I'm walking in his footsteps or trying to continue his work. So yes, I think that is a huge part of why that's part of their education plan. But something else I want to say is that including the activism piece was important, because Afro-Latinidad and Afro-Boricua pride, it isn't just about dancing, right? Or music, you know, the stuff that makes us feel good. Now we're talking about policy. We're talking about changing the way that, you know, laws are made or programs come together or addressing racial injustice. And it is hard to do that when people are not counting themselves as Black, when you can't say this population exists and look at this health disparity. Why are so many Black Puerto Ricans, having poorer health outcomes compared to white Puerto Ricans or fairer skinned Puerto Ricans, if you want to just talk about skin color? So that's why you got to count. And so that's part of why the education is important, because then, you can actually track the disparity and then you can do something about it, because that's ultimately what it's about.
Yes, your documentary takes you on so many different paths, because it shows you the harsh history, but then it also gives you something hopeful to see in terms of the people.
Yeah.
I really enjoyed this. So
I'm so glad. Thank you. And thank you to everyone for your comments. We've been reading them.
Absolutely. Natasha, I could sit here and talk to you all day.
Same.
But unfortunately, we are out of time.
We are. But listen, the conversation don't stop. So, go find the documentary on YouTube, go find it on Amazon Prime, give it a thumbs up, give it 5 stars, or however you feel in your heart. But every view confirms that this story matters. And I had to fight for this story. I had to fight to say, hey, you guys should really distribute this. We should invest time in this. So if you show that you watched it, it really does make a difference.
Thank you. And is there anything else you want to promote? Or do you want to drop your socials? Like, the floor is yours.
Find me on social media. I am around. I'm working on my screen time, because in quarantine, it's rough. Your phone's like, you have 24 hours of screen time. And you're like, oh my God, let me get off my phone. So I'm not on my phone all the time, but you can follow me at Natasha S. Alford on Twitter and Instagram. And I'm getting through your comments and feedback. And I would just love to hear what you think and what kind of stories you want to see, because this is not the end. That was just scratching the surface of the things that we can talk about with these issues.
Once again, thank you so much. And thank you to the Caribbean Cultural Center African Diaspora Institute. Thank you guys for watching. Please come back. There'll be more of these conversations in Afro-Picks. And this is Major signing off. Once again, thank you, Natasha. And we will see you later.
Thanks, Major. Thank you, everybody. Good night.